Hello everyone, this is Gaurav from Automation Hacks, and in this video, we are going to understand what Java optionals are all about. So, Java 8 introduced a very nice construct in which you can work with null pointer exceptions. Let's understand this with a real example. So, there is no better way than to actually learn with some tests, and that is what we are going to do here. So, I would like to draw your attention first to what optional really is or how does it solve a problem, right? So, optional is a way in which you can get some sort of, checks around or working around with objects that are of null types. So how do you create an optional within Java? So there are a couple of ways. One is you can directly use the optional class and then create as a sort of empty, optional. This is going to give, optional and which can accept a type, which is basically the object that you are sort of wrapping into. Whether this particular optional actually has a value or is it null. So how do I check that is I can call the is present method on any optional and it will tell me whether it has, the sort of object that it wraps, is it null or not. Similarly, I can have a non-null value as well as within an optional. So I can have a string called as automation hacks and I can directly use optional.off and give it the object that I want, right? So again, you see it returns you an optional of type string, and I can again check whether this particular object has something which is non-null. So in this case, I expect it to be true because it is an actual string, right? Let's run this. I expected this to be true, right? But actually, it is false. What did I do wrong? Of course, I don't have the correct type defined here. So it's optional. Instead of that, it should be optional name. And let's run this now. Okay, so all good now. So this is basically a couple of ways in which you can create an optional, but the most common way that you will work with is using, sort of streams. And we can talk about that as well when we talk about streams in more detail. But I have another example for you. So let's try to understand how you can have a sort of nested optional with this null check, right? So I have two sort of classes for you to consider. I have a user class wherein a user basically can have an address and I have this address class wherein every address can have basically a street and then it has a couple of getters and setters with which I can set the address or, get the address. Similarly, create an object of address or not, right? So now I have an instance of address and I set one address to it. I create an instance of user and then I also set this address to it, right? So this is a perfectly valid user with a perfectly valid address. But now say have a null address, right? Somehow in my program, the address turns null, right? So to simulate that, I will have a null address where I'm explicitly setting the street as null. And I also have a dedicated user which sets this address. Now, before Java 8, like say you had to work with something like this, you don't really know whether, an object that is created, is it null or not? So you would probably work around it something like this, wherein you will first check if the user is not null, then you will get the address within that user object. Then you will also check whether this address is not null. And if it is not, then you'll get the street. Finally, you'll check whether the street is not null and then return the street. And if you're, you also return a default. So now this is a null safe method prior to the optional API. And you can already see that for every level of nesting, it turns out to be very verbose, right? So, and how would you actually check? You will get the output from this method and then you can assert. So I have two checks here. One is where the street is actually valid. I still do the null check. And then in the other case, when it is null, I check whether the method actually returned me not specified. Now, Java 8 makes this much more easier, and we'll see an example of that. So now instead of your normal sort of user object, you can use optional, and then you can call off nullable, right? Which is you can provide it an object which you don't know right now, but it can either be null, right? So it will return you an optional of user. And then let's check how this, how can we basically compress the same check that we did. So here, what we are doing is for the optional user that I have, right? I can basically map that user and get its address, right? And if it is valid, then I can use again map and then get the street. And finally, if in any of these cases the objects that I'm working with are null, then I can use or else and specify what needs to be returned. So if you take a look and compare it to what we have here, this is a much more concise way of working with objects which are nested and might be null, right? In this case. Um, so let's go to the usage, and again we do something similar where we actually give it a user which is not null and a user which is null. And in both the cases, we expect the same sort of outcome. So let's run this test and check if it is fine. And of course, it is fine. Uh, Lastly, one neat thing that you can do also is say something is null and you want to basically, when it is null, you want to return your own custom exception. So this is how you would do it in, before Java 11. So if you have, say, some value which is null and you have a result, then, and you're trying to do something on that, object which can be null, you know that of course it will throw a null pointer exception, and in this case you catch it and then you return a new custom exception. Now Java 8 sort of optional API makes it much more simpler, so you can just use off nullable to get an instance of optional, and then directly when you try to do something, you can just use the or else throw sort of method and provide it the exception that you want it to throw. So in this case, if this particular value is actually null, then I want to return an instance of a custom exception. So notice I use the sort of method reference that we already introduced. So I use this class and I use new as a way to create an object of this exception. And here custom exception is just a way to extend the standard exception within Java. And then I call my method. So this is one way in which you can very easily simplify the use case where you want to throw a certain exception using optional. And that's all for optional in Java. It's a very neat way of writing a very null safe code, and I hope you will use it. And that's all for this video, and I'll see you in the next one.